August 14th, 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas, USA. The heat in Texas was not like the heat in North Africa. It was heavy, wet, and smelled of baking clay. Elfrida stood frozen in the middle of the endless corn row, the towering stalks blocking the wind. The silence was absolute, save for the distant hum of a vehicle. She dared not look down at her boots, but she could feel the wet slickness inside the leather. The oversized right boot had rubbed her heel raw hours ago. Now she was sure the skin was gone. "Do not show weakness," she whispered to herself, repeating the warnings from the chaotic final days in Cherbourg. Weakness invited cruelty. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, gripping her basket of corn so tight her knuckles turned white. It was the tall American sergeant, the one the other prisoners called the Cowboy because of his rolling gait and the way he wore his hat low. He stopped 3 feet away. He did not have his rifle raised. He was looking at the dust around her feet. A single drop of dark blood had seeped through the cracked leather of her boot, staining the dry Texas earth. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was gravel, not the bark of a guard. "You're done." Elfrida stepped back, shielding the injury with her other foot. "I work," she said in broken English, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I work good." He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance with terrifying ease. Before she could gasp, the ground fell away. He had scooped her up. She was airborne, held securely against a dusty uniform that smelled of tobacco and starch. "Quiet now," he murmured, walking towards the idling machinery at the field's edge. "If you believe acts of silent humanity can transcend war, please consider subscribing and sharing where you are watching from." 3 weeks earlier, the processing center, New York. The processing center in New York had been a blur of gray concrete and harsh electric lights, but Texas was a shock of color so violent it hurt Elfrida's eyes. The sky was an impossible, relentless blue, and the earth was the color of dried blood. Elfrida stood in a line of 20 women, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their trembling. She wore the standard-issue prisoner uniform, a stiff denim shirt and trousers that smelled of starch and strong chemical detergent. On her back, the letters PW were stenciled in white paint, marking her as property of the United States government. She was 23 years old, a former auxiliary nurse for the Wehrmacht, and she was terrified. "Next!" a corporal shouted from the supply table. Elfrida stepped forward. She kept her eyes lowered, fixing her gaze on the splintered wooden planks of the platform. The propaganda broadcasts in Berlin had been clear. Americans were gangsters, lawless cowboys who took pleasure in humiliation. She expected a blow, or at least a jeer. Instead, a pair of heavy leather boots thudded onto the table in front of her. "Size 7, men's," the supply clerk muttered, not looking up from his clipboard. "Smallest we got left. Take 'em." Elfrida stared at the boots. They were monstrous things, thick-soled and wide, designed for a heavy infantryman marching through mud, not a nurse accustomed to hospital corridors. She looked down at her own feet, clad only in thin, worn wool socks. "Please," she whispered, her English clumsy and thick. "Too big." The clerk looked up then, wiping sweat from his forehead. He didn't look angry, just tired. "It's what we have, Fräulein. Geneva rules say we gotta clothe you. Doesn't say it has to be custom fit. Move along." Elfrida grabbed the boots. They were heavy in her arms like 2 stones. She shuffled to the waiting area where the other women were lacing up. As she sat on the bench, she slid her foot into the right boot. It swam. There was at least an inch of space around her heel. When she walked, the stiff leather would slide up and down, grinding against her skin like sandpaper against soft wood. "Stuff them with paper," a voice whispered in German. It was Helga, an older woman who had been captured with her in Cherbourg. If you complain, they will think you are refusing to work. Refusing to work. The thought sent a chill through Elfrida despite the sweltering heat. In the stories she had been told, prisoners who didn't work disappeared. She nodded silently and began to lace the boots tight, pulling the strings until the leather puckered. She stood up. The boots clomped loudly against the floor, a clumsy, hollow sound that announced her presence to the world. Outside, a convoy of vehicles waited to transport them to the main camp. At the head of the column sat a jeep, its engine idling with a steady, rhythmic chug. Leaning against the hood was a sergeant. He was tall, with a sun-weathered face and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't shouting like the others. He was just watching them, his eyes tracking their movements with a quiet, unnerving intensity. Elfrida climbed into the back of the transport truck, dragging her heavy feet. She looked through the slats of the truck bed. The sergeant, the cowboy, swung himself into the driver's seat of the jeep. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like the land itself, hard, silent, and inevitable. The truck lurched forward, kicking up red dust. Elfrida's heel rubbed against the stiff leather of the boot. A small sting. Just a small sting, she told herself. She could endure it. She had to. The Texas sun did not just shine, it possessed weight. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down on the cornfields of Camp Hearn like a heavy, wet blanket, suffocating the air between the stalks. Elfrida moved mechanically down her assigned row, her hands wrapped in thick canvas gloves that were already soaked through with sweat. The corn here grew taller than any crop she had seen in Bavaria. It formed endless, rustling green walls that blocked out the horizon and the breeze. With every step, the oversized leather boots betrayed her. Thud slide, thud slide. The stiff heel of the right boot caught on the uneven furrows of the earth, slipping up and down against her ankle. At first, it was just a friction burn, a dull heat distinct from the weather, but as the hours dragged on, the friction turned into a rhythmic biting sensation, as if small teeth were gnawing at her skin. She paused for a moment to wipe the stinging sweat from her eyes. Down the line, Helga was working with the grim efficiency of a machine, snapping the ears of corn and tossing them into the burlap sack. They had signed the voluntary labor contracts, 80 cents a day in canteen coupons. It was a fortune that meant chocolate, decent soap, and paper to write home. But the cost was this relentless baking oven. Through a gap in the swaying stalks, Elfrida saw him. The sergeant, Vance, was parked on the edge of the dirt road that bordered the field. His jeep sat idling, a mechanical beast resting in the dust. He wasn't patrolling. He wasn't screaming, "Schnell, Schnell," or pacing with a baton like the guards in the transit camps back in Europe. He was simply leaning against the hood of the vehicle, his arms crossed over his chest, a canteen hanging from his belt. He took a slow drink of water, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked out over the field. His gaze drifted over the rows of working women. When his eyes swept past Elfrida's section, she flinched, instinctively hunching her shoulders to make herself smaller. The PW stenciled on her back felt like a target. In Germany, silence from a superior officer meant calculation. It meant they were looking for a reason to make an example of someone. Vance's stillness unnerved her more than the shouting would have. Is he waiting for one of us to collapse? She wondered, her heart beating a little faster. Is he counting our mistakes? Keep moving, Elfrida, Helga hissed from the next row, not breaking her rhythm. If you stop, he will come over. Elfrida nodded, swallowing the dryness in her throat. She forced her foot forward. The leather boot slid up her heel again, harder this time. A sharp, hot pinch radiated up her leg. She winced, but bit her lip, grabbing the next stalk of corn with unnecessary force. She would not stop. She would not give the silent cowboy a reason to leave his jeep. The next morning, the simple act of standing up required a summon of courage Elfrida was not sure she possessed. In the dim gray light of the barracks, surrounded by the soft breathing of sleeping women, she sat on the edge of her cot and stared at her right foot. The wool sock was stuck to her heel. The dried blood and lymph had formed a crude, biological glue, fusing the rough fabric to the raw flesh beneath. With a sharp, hissing intake of breath, she peeled the wool away. The skin at the back of her heel was gone. In its place was a weeping, angry red crater, the edges white and puckered. It throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a dull, insistent drum of pain that echoed up her calf. "Go to the infirmary," Helga whispered from the next bunk, her voice thick with sleep but laced with concern. "It looks infected, Elfrida. You cannot walk on that." Elfrida shook her head violently, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp panic. No. The refusal was instant, born of a fear that had been drilled into her for years. In the Reich, weakness was a capital offense. The propaganda officers had warned them about the Americans endlessly. They were ruthless capitalists who only fed those who could work. The sick, the lame, the unnütze Esser, useless eaters, were discarded. If she went to the doctor, she would be marked. She would be separated from the group. And then, she was certain, she would disappear. She reached under her thin pillow and pulled out a small sewing kit she had managed to hide during the initial inspection. She didn't use the needle. Instead, she lifted the hem of her white cotton slip, one of the few personal items she had left from home. Her fingers trembled as she tore a long strip of fabric from the bottom. The sound of tearing cloth seemed deafening in the quiet room, like a shout. She folded the cotton into a thick pad and pressed it against the open wound. It did little to cushion the exposed nerves, but it would soak up the fresh blood. Then she looked at the boots. They sat on the floor like waiting traps, heavy, dark, and indifferent. They were objects of pure utility, devoid of comfort. Elfrida took a deep breath, clenched her jaw until her teeth ached, and shoved her bandaged foot into the right boot. A white-hot bolt of pain shot up her leg, seizing her muscle in a cramp. She gasped, tears springing instantly to her eyes, but she did not cry out. She laced the boot tight, tighter than before, hoping the pressure would numb the sensation. It didn't. It only trapped the pain, pressing the stiff, unyielding leather against the makeshift bandage. She walked to the door. Every step was a negotiation with agony. Left foot, normal. Right foot, don't limp. Left foot, normal. Outside, the air was already thick with humidity. The prisoners lined up for the morning count. Sergeant Vance was there, standing by the open gate, his clipboard in hand. As the women filed past him toward the waiting trucks, Elfrida focused on a point in the distance, ignoring the sweat stinging her forehead. She forced her spine straight. She forced her gait to be even. But as she passed him, she felt his gaze. It wasn't the leering look of the guards she had feared. It was something heavier, more precise. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the dust, watching the way her right boot dragged, just a fraction of an inch, leaving a slightly deeper trail in the Texas dirt. He saw. She knew he saw. And that terrified her more than the pain ever could. The policy of non-fraternization hung over Camp Hearn as heavily as the humidity. It was a visible wall, built not of barbed wire, but of silence. An American soldier could issue orders. He could correct mistakes, but he could not ask a prisoner how she was feeling. To show concern was to blur the lines between victor and vanquished. And in 1945, those lines were drawn in iron. Sergeant Vance did not stay at the edge of the field that afternoon. Elfrida heard him before she saw him. She was deep in the 14th row, her hands raw from snapping the thick corn stalks. Behind her, the low mechanical growl of an engine cut through the rustling of the leaves. It was a distinctive sound. The throat-clearing rumble of a Willys Jeep dropped into its lowest gear, crawling forward at a walking pace. She stiffened, but did not turn around. He is hunting, she thought, a cold sweat breaking out along her spine that had nothing to do with the sun. He saw me stumble, and now he is coming to finish it. The Jeep moved parallel to her row, crushing the dry husks of the outer plants under its tires. Elfrida focused all her energy on her right leg. She commanded the muscles to contract, to lift, to step without favoring the heel. But the boot fought her. The heavy leather had become a vice, clamping down on the makeshift bandage, which was now thoroughly soaked. Every step sent a fresh shockwave of nausea through her stomach. She could feel his eyes. The Jeep was close enough now that she could smell the exhaust fumes mixing with the sweet scent of the corn. Vance wasn't shouting. He wasn't honking the horn to hurry them up. He was simply matching her pace, a silent, metal shadow tracking her progress across the field. "Don't look," she whispered to herself, her lips barely moving. "Just work." She grabbed an ear of corn, twisted it, and threw it into the sack, dragging behind her. She stepped forward. The pain was blinding, a sharp spike that made her vision swim. She faltered, her knee buckling for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. The engine note of the Jeep changed instantly. It revved slightly, then idled down again, closer this time. Elfrida risked a glance sideways. Vance was there, one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, his hat shading his eyes. He wasn't looking at her face, or her hands, or the corn. His gaze was fixed relentlessly downward, locked onto the dusty, oversized boots that seemed to swallow her ankles. He knew. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't looking for laziness. He was analyzing the injury. But to Elfrida, distorted by fear and pain, this scrutiny felt like a predator toying with a wounded animal before the kill. She gritted her teeth, forcing her foot down into the dirt again, unknowingly squeezing the last drops of resistance from her body. Inside the boot, something wet and warm began to slide. The end of the corn row shimmered in the distance, distorted by waves of heat rising from the ground. It was perhaps only 50 yards away. But to Elfrida, it might as well have been across the Atlantic. Every step was now a conscious manual operation. Lift, swing, plant, scream internally, repeat. The liquid in her right boot was no longer just sweat. She could feel the distinct, slippery warmth of fresh blood sliding between her toes. The friction from the loose heel had chewed through the cotton slip, through the scab, and was now grinding against raw meat. The pain was so absolute, it drowned out the rustling of the corn and the drone of the cicadas. Behind her, the engine of the Jeep cut out. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. Elfrida froze, her breath caught in her throat, jagged and shallow. He has stopped, she thought. This is it. Panic, cold and sharp, overrode her exhaustion. She tried to lunge forward, desperate to look busy, to look useful, but her body had reached its limit. As she planted her right foot to pivot, her ankle rolled inside the cavernous space of the boot. There was no support, only empty air and stiff leather. She went down hard. The earth rushed up to meet her, the dry stalk scratching her face as she hit the dirt. The basket of corn spilled, sending yellow ears tumbling into the dust. For a second she lay there, stunned by the impact, waiting for the shout, for the blow, for the gunshot. But there was only silence. Elfrida scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ignored the throbbing in her leg and tried to stand at attention, dusting off her uniform with trembling hands. She looked down. She couldn't help it. The right boot sat crookedly on her foot, the laces loosened by the fall. Along the seam where the sole met the leather, a dark, viscous fluid was bubbling out. It dripped onto the dry, pale Texas dust, creating a stark, almost black constellation of spots. It was undeniably blood. She backed away, shielding the injury with her other foot, her eyes darting around wildly. Do not show weakness. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the blinding sun. Elfrida looked up, squinting against the glare. Sergeant Vance stood there. He had left the jeep. He was standing barely 3 feet away, his thumbs hooked into his belt, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't looking at the spilled corn. He wasn't looking at her terrified face. His eyes were locked on the red stain expanding in the dust at her feet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravel that vibrated in the heavy air. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elfrida braced herself, closing her eyes for a heartbeat, waiting for the end. "Ma'am," he said again. His voice was gravel, not the bark of a guard. "You're done." Elfrida stepped back, her heel screaming in protest as she shifted her weight. She shielded the injury with her other foot, her hands trembling violently at her sides. The other women in the row had stopped working. They stood like statues among the corn, watching with wide, fearful eyes. The silence of the field was absolute. "I work," Elfrida stammered, the English words tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked desperately at the sack of corn she had dropped. "I work good. Please." Vance didn't argue. He didn't reach for the baton on his belt. He didn't shout for the guards to come and drag her away. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance with terrifying ease. Before Elfrida could gasp, before she could formulate a plea for mercy, the ground fell away. He had bent down and scooped her up. It happened with the fluid, practiced motion of a man used to lifting heavy feed sacks or mending fences. One arm went behind her back, the other under her knees. Elfrida went rigid, her breath hitching in a strangled sob. She expected to be thrown, to be tossed into the dirt like a sack of refuse, but the impact never came. She was airborne, held securely against a dusty uniform. For the first time in years, she was not supporting her own weight. The smell of him filled her nose, not the sterile, chemical scent of the processing center, but the organic, lived-in smell of tobacco, sun-baked cotton, and honest sweat. It was a human smell. "Quiet now," he murmured, more to the air than to her. He turned and began to walk toward the edge of the field. Elfrida stared over his shoulder. She saw Helga's mouth drop open. She saw the other prisoners lower their heads, not in submission, but in confusion. The American cowboy was carrying the German enemy. It was an image that did not fit into any frame of reference they possessed. Vance walked with a steady, rolling gait. He didn't seem to mind the blood that was surely staining his sleeve from her boot. He reached the Willys Jeep idling on the dirt track. Usually prisoners were herded into the back of trucks, standing room only. Vance didn't take her to a truck. He walked to the passenger side of his vehicle. He shifted her weight slightly, freeing one hand to unlatch the low metal door. He lowered her onto the canvas seat. He didn't drop her. He placed her there. As her weight settled into the seat, a fresh wave of pain shot up her leg, but it was distant now, dulled by the sheer shock of the moment. Vance stood back and closed the door with a metallic click. He looked at her one last time, his eyes briefly flicking to the bloody boot, then to her pale face. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was only a grim, weary pragmatism. He walked around the front of the hood to the driver's side, leaving Elfrida sitting alone in the front seat of the American war machine, trembling not from the cold, but from the shattering of her world. The engine roared to life, a sudden, guttural vibration that Elfrida felt through the canvas seat and into her very bones. She gripped the metal frame of the windshield, her knuckles white. She had seen these vehicles, these jeeps, roaming the shattered streets of Cherbourg, usually filled with shouting men and bristling with machine guns. To be inside one was surreal, like sitting in the belly of the beast. Vance shifted gears with a sharp clack. The vehicle lurched forward, tires crunching over the dry corn stalks before finding the rutted dirt road. The cabin was intimate, uncomfortably so. There were no glass windows to separate them from the world or from each other, only the open air and the rushing wind. Elfrida pressed herself against the passenger door, trying to put as much distance as possible between her shoulder and the American's arm. But the Jeep was narrow. Every bump in the road threw them momentarily closer. She stole a glance at him. He drove with one hand draped over the top of the steering wheel, his profile sharp against the passing blur of green fields. He seemed completely at ease, ignoring the prisoner bleeding onto the floor mat of his government property. Elfrida looked down at her feet. The blood had pooled around the sole of the right boot, dark and shiny against the rubber matting. Panic flared in her chest. She was dirtying his machine. This would be the offense, she thought. This would be why he punished her. She tried to wipe the sole of her boot against the hem of her trousers, making a small, frantic scuffling sound. Vance didn't look away from the road, but his hand moved. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded square of blue cotton, a handkerchief. He held it out to her. Elfrida flinched, staring at the cloth. She didn't take it. She assumed he wanted her to clean the floor. "I am sorry," she whispered, reaching down toward the mat. "I will clean." "No," he said. The word was soft but firm. He nudged the cloth toward her face, not the floor. "For you. You're sweating." Elfrida froze. Her hand hovered in midair. She looked from the clean blue cloth to his face. He was still watching the road, his expression unchanged, as if offering a personal item to an enemy was the most mundane thing in the world. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she took the handkerchief. It was warm from his pocket. It smelled faintly of soap and tobacco. She brought it to her face, dabbing at the grime and sweat on her forehead. The fabric was soft, not the scratchy wool she was used to. For the rest of the drive, the silence in the Jeep changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a predator and prey. It was a confused, fragile quiet. Elfrida clutched the blue cloth in her lap like a shield. The wind whipped her hair across her face, drying the tears she hadn't realized were falling. The monster beside her shifted gears again, slowing down as the white wooden buildings of the camp infirmary came into view. He wasn't taking her to the prison cells. He was taking her to get help. And for the first time since her capture, the rigid architecture of her hate began to develop a hairline crack. The transition from the blinding Texas sun to the interior of the infirmary was jarring. The room was cool, starkly white, and smelled aggressively of rubbing alcohol and pine cleaner. It was a scent that Elfrida associated with the field hospitals in France, a smell that usually preceded bad news. Vance did not leave her at the door. He walked her to an empty examination table and nodded for her to sit. She perched on the edge, the paper crinkling loudly beneath her, clutching the blue handkerchief he had given her like a lifeline. A door swung open, and an American captain with a stethoscope around his neck strode in. He looked tired, his sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He glanced at Vance, then at Elfrida, and finally at the trail of dark drops on the linoleum floor. "What do we have, Sergeant?" the doctor asked, pulling a stool over. "Foot injury, sir," Vance replied, removing his hat. "Work detail." The doctor grunted and knelt in front of Elfrida. He reached for her right foot. Elfrida flinched, her muscles locking up. She expected him to rip the boot off, to be rough and dismissive with a prisoner of war. But his hands were gentle. He carefully loosened the blood-stiffened laces, working them open one by one. When he finally eased the heavy leather boot off her foot, the smell of copper and infection filled the small space. The doctor hissed through his teeth. The makeshift bandage she had torn from her slip was soaked through, fused to the raw flesh of her heel. "Good God," the doctor muttered. He looked up, his eyes hard. "How long has she been walking on this?" Elfrida looked down, shame burning her cheeks. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that she was strong, that she could still work. "Since morning, likely," Vance answered from the corner. The doctor stood up, turning to face the sergeant. "You're running a work crew, Vance, not a death march. Geneva says they get fit-for-duty checks. This woman shouldn't have been in the field." Elfrida held her breath. This was it, the moment the soldier would blame the prisoner to save himself. She waited for him to say she hid it, that she was stubborn, that it was her own fault. "I missed it, sir," Vance said. His voice was even, devoid of defensiveness. "I didn't check the equipment properly before we rolled out. My mistake." Elfrida stared at him. He stood tall, accepting the reprimand without blinking. He had lied, or at least he had omitted the truth to protect her. He took the blame for her fear. The doctor sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Well, she's done for the week. Infection risk is high." He turned back to Elfrida, his expression softening. "I'm going to clean this. It will sting." He applied a cool, yellow ointment to the wound. It burned fiercely, but the sensation was clean, purifying. As the doctor wrapped her foot in thick, white gauze, clean, soft, abundant gauze, more than she had seen in months, Elfrida looked past him to the tall man standing by the door. Vance was watching the procedure quietly. He met her gaze and gave a barely perceptible nod. In that sterile white room, surrounded by the enemy, Elfrida felt something shift inside her chest. The wall of propaganda, built brick by brick over years of war, had just lost its foundation. The rumors traveled faster than the transport trucks. By the time Elfrida hopped back into the barracks on her bandaged foot, the story had already mutated. Some whispered that she had been interrogated. Others feared she had been forced to trade favors for medical treatment. The barracks were hot and smelled of unwashed bodies and lingering fear. Elfrida sat on her cot, exhausted. Helga sat beside her, her face drawn with worry. "Did he hurt you?" Helga asked, her voice low so the die-hard party loyalists at the end of the room wouldn't hear. "They say he took you away alone." "He took me to the doctor," Elfrida said, her voice steady. "That is all." A murmur went through the room. It was difficult for them to reconcile the monsters of the radio broadcasts with a man who drove a wounded enemy to a clinic. It was easier to believe in cruelty. Cruelty made sense of their captivity. Kindness was a dangerous variable. "Be careful, Elfrida," an older woman warned from across the aisle. "The Americans do nothing for free. There is always a price." Elfrida looked down at her hands, remembering the clean blue handkerchief. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe they are just men." The door to the barracks banged open. A young American corporal stood there, holding a cardboard box. He scanned the room, consulting a slip of paper. "Prisoner 402? Elfrida stiffened, grabbing her crutches. "Here." The corporal walked over and dropped the box on the foot of her bed. He didn't say a word, just turned and left. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at the box as if it might explode. Elfrida reached out and opened the flaps. Inside lay a pair of boots. They were not the monstrous boat-like infantry boots she had dragged through the corn. These were smaller. The leather was darker, more supple, perhaps used but well cared for. She checked the tongue. Size 6. There was no note. There was no demand for repayment. Just the boots. Ignoring the pain in her heel, Elfrida slid her uninjured left foot into the boot. It didn't swim. It hugged her arch. It supported her ankle without biting into the bone. It fit. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. It wasn't just leather and rubber. It was an acknowledgement of her humanity. Vance had gone back to supply, argued with a clerk, or perhaps traded something of his own, just to ensure she didn't have to walk in pain again. He had seen the problem, taken the blame, and fixed it. She stood up, testing the weight. The boots were light. Walking to the window, she looked out across the compound. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the dust. In the distance, near the main gate, the familiar silhouette of the sergeant leaned against the railing of the watchtower. He was smoking a cigarette, looking at nothing in particular. Elfrida pressed her hand against the screen mesh. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But as she watched, he tipped the brim of his hat up just an inch, acknowledging the barracks, before turning back to the horizon. Elfrida took a breath, the air filling her lungs without the sharp catch of fear for the first time in months. May 1946. The war was over. The news had come not with a bang, but with the slow, bureaucratic dismantling of the camp. The barbed wire, once a symbol of containment, now looked like rusting string against the vibrant Texas spring. The cornfields lay fallow, waiting for a harvest the prisoners would not be there to gather. Elfrida stood by the transport truck, her duffel bag heavy on her shoulder. Inside, carefully wrapped in newspaper, were the boots Sergeant Vance had given her. She was wearing her own shoes now, repaired and polished, but she could not leave the boots behind. They were evidence. They were proof that in the midst of hatred, something else had survived. The compound was a hive of organized chaos. Names were called. Rosters were checked. The American soldiers moved with a lighter step, talking about baseball and sweethearts, their job as captors finally dissolving. Vance was near the gate, leaning against the hood of his Jeep. He looked older than he had the year before, or perhaps just more tired. He wasn't directing traffic today. He was just watching them go, a silent sentinel witnessing the end of an era. Elfrida broke from the line. It was forbidden, strictly speaking, but the rules had softened in the final hours. She walked toward the Jeep, her heart hammered against her ribs, echoing that first day in the cornfield, but there was no fear now. Vance straightened up as she approached. He didn't speak. He took off his hat, holding it against his chest, a gesture of respect that stunned her. Elfrida stopped 3 feet away. She had rehearsed a speech in her head, sentences about gratitude and mercy, but looking at his weathered face, words felt unnecessary. They had never needed words. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded scrap of paper. On it, she had written 2 words in English, practiced until the letters were round and perfect. Thank you. She didn't hand it to him. That would cross a line. Instead, she placed it gently on the canvas passenger seat of the Jeep, right where she had sat that day with her bleeding foot. Vance looked at the paper, then back at her. He gave a slow, singular nod. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but more a recognition. "Safe travels, ma'am," he said quietly. "Goodbye, cowboy," she whispered in German. She turned and walked back to the truck, climbing up without stumbling. As the convoy roared to life and lurched forward, kicking up clouds of red dust, Elfrida pushed her way to the back slats. She watched the camp recede. The barracks, the watchtowers, and the green fields grew smaller. The last thing she saw was the small, dark shape of the Jeep and the man standing beside it. He didn't turn away until the truck turned the corner. Elfrida sat back, closing her eyes. She was returning to a city of rubble, to a country that had to be rebuilt from ash. But as the Texas wind cooled her face, she knew she was bringing back something stronger than stone. She was bringing the memory of a silent ride, a clean handkerchief, and the knowledge that even enemies can heal each other.